Okay, welcome everyone to today's panel, Iraq and the United States, Return to the Status Quo or Calm Before the Storm, hosted by the Quincy Institute. If you're not familiar with the Quincy Institute, we're a think tank based in Washington, D.C., and our approach to U.S. foreign policy is rooted in restraint, or the idea that the United States should focus on diplomacy and consider use of force as a option of last resort. So today we're joined by a very esteemed panel, and in no particular order, I'm going to introduce them. We have Sajjad Jihad. He is a fellow at Century International and director of the Shia Politics Working Group, an Iraqi political analyst based in Baghdad. He is the managing director of Bridge, an Iraqi NGO and consultancy focused on development projects for young people. His main focus is on public policy and governance, and he's frequently published. He recently published the book God's Man in Iraq, The Life and Leadership of Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, and that's one of the most accessible books for an English reader on arguably not arguably, the most important Shia theologian in our time. So I highly recommend everyone read it. Next, we're joined by Simona Fulton, who is an independent journalist and documentary maker based in the Middle East. From 2018 to 2023, she was based full-time in Baghdad, covering the end of the war against ISIS and the fallout between the US and Iran-aligned groups. Her writing has been published in The Guardian, The Financial Times, The Intercept, Politico, and Foreign Policy, among others. As a director, producer, and on-screen correspondent, she has produced TV reports and documentaries for Al Jazeera English, France 24, and PBS. She has also published exclusive investigations in partnership with Type Investigations and the Pulitzer Center, which are both great organizations. Next, we have Mohammed Shumari. He is a professor at Al Nahrain University in the College of Political Science in Baghdad, and he's chairman of the Sumeria Foundation for International Affairs, which is an Iraqi nonprofit, an independent foundation that focuses on enhancing Iraq's relations with its neighbors. And then last but not least, we're joined by our own Stephen Simon. He is a professor of practice in Middle East Studies at the Henry Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. He's a senior research fellow here at Quincy. He previously served as executive director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies for the US and Middle East. And from 2011 to 2012, he served on the National Security Council as Senior Director for Middle Eastern and North African Affairs. He also served on the NSC staff from 1994 to 1999 on counterterrorism in the Middle East. His most recent book, Grand Illusion, The Rise and Fall of American Ambition in the Middle East, was published in 2023, and I highly recommend everyone read that, especially if you want to know a practitioner's history of our often beleaguered policies in the Middle East. And with that, I'll get started. I'm the Deputy Director of the Middle East Program, and today I'll just be serving as the moderator. So we're going to go straight into the Q&A, and my first question is for Stephen. Stephen, Ambassador Romanowski's tenure is coming to an end. What would you say has been the change in U.S. policy towards Iraq during her tenure? And what is that policy? In other words, what is the U.S. doing in Iraq? What does the U.S. want with Iraq? What are our ambitions in Iraq?
Sure. I mean, I'm a little disappointed that no one else is going to have a chance to speak in this session, because it'll take me, a while to cover all those points. But perhaps we can communicate with them later in writing. I'm just pulling your leg. Ambassador Romanowski's tenure in Iraq, I think, has been a productive one. It happened to coincide with a change in U.S. policy. And that was more, a matter of accident than, deliberate planning. Matt Tueller, her predecessor, was on his way out to retire from the Foreign Service, and Alina was teed up as his replacement a while before the change in U.S. policy toward Iraq had emerged, and that change, in a nutshell, was to shift from a primarily military relationship with Iraq that was focused very much on defeating the ISIS threat in that country, and to some extent was on automatic pilot as a consequence of the 20-year war on terror and the long occupation of Iraq. When Alina Romanowski arrived, she essentially unveiled the new U.S. policy, which was meant to restructure the relationship, the bilateral relationship with Iraq on, if I can put it this way, secular lines. That is to say, a normal bilateral relationship between the United States and a friendly foreign state, not set in the context of wartime operations, but having a much broader agenda that would essentially be similar to the agenda that the U.S. might have with other countries in the Middle East, let's say Egypt, for example. None of these examples or parallels are perfect, but they'll have to do. One of the things that made this possible was the crushing of the ISIS threat, which removed an indigenous threat, as it were, in Iraq, that was also an enemy of the United States, and which the United States had fought in the latter quarter, really, of the long war on terror. The new relationship focused on energy, good governance, essentially on the kind of agenda that the IMF would typically pursue in a country like Iraq, particularly in a post-conflict phase. So I think this transition has been executed rather deftly under Romanowski's tenure as ambassador. For an ambassador to avoid, serious problems in his or her tenure in Iraq, I mean, historically speaking, would have been kind of difficult because the relationship itself was rocky, in that the United States competes with another foreign state for influence in Iraq, and that was kind of problematic for U.S. Foreign policy, which does not value sharing. It's sort of what it required, and the United States isn't especially adroit at that. The fact that Iraq has a hybrid army, which is also difficult for the United States to manage in terms of a satisfactory relationship, didn't help matters. And the fact that the army was a hybrid by virtue of the relationship of its militia structure, which was in turn linked to Iran, an adversary of the United States, didn't make things easier either. But Ambassador Romanowski, I think, avoided some of the pitfalls that might have marred her tenure. The new ambassador, the incoming ambassador, who hasn't been confirmed yet, I don't believe, is Tracy Jacobson. She's unlike Alina Romanowski, a career diplomat who served in at least a half a dozen posts prior to her nomination as ambassador to Iraq. In her brief nomination remarks at her hearing, the remarks that couldn't have taken more than 5 minutes to deliver, she said at least 10 things that angered Iraqis across the political spectrum. That was a remarkable accomplishment for the drafters of her witness statement. But she did the sorts of things that Washington, in a congressional setting, really needs to hear. That the United States is on Iran's case, that the United States is on the case of any group in Iraq that sides with Iran. Particularly, she appeared to conflate the militias, especially those linked with Iran, to ISIS. not in any kind of operational sense, but grouping them both as adversaries of the United States, that the U.S. would attack, she said, with all the means or any of the means at its disposal. You can imagine how this struck a somewhat discordant note at a sensitive moment, but that was really destined for Congress. The members of Congress were the audience for those remarks, and not Iraqis. So, to sum up, Adam, from my perspective, I think the U.S. is on a pretty good trajectory with Iraq, and I have to say that a Sudanese visit to Washington was quite successful. Very little of it concerned military issues. At least that's my understanding of how the meetings played out. He met a wide array of U.S. constituents, particularly in the business sector, and he had some quality time with the president. This is pretty good in the context of a bilateral relationship, especially a problematic one or a burdened one, let me put it that way, like that between the United States and Iraq. I'll stop there, Adam. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Steve. Mohammed, I was just in Baghdad about a month ago, and I was lucky enough to meet with you and meet with Sajjad. I have two questions for you, Mohammed. Steven's talking about how the ambassador nominee is talking tough in Congress, which is necessary for domestic U.S. politics, but then we have a softer tone when it comes to our relations inside Baghdad. So my first question is, do you think Iraqis, especially Iraqi elites who are making decisions, understand that dynamic? Do they understand the different tone that exists in Washington and in Baghdad and the reasons behind that? Or does it cause problems in the relationship? And my second question is, just anecdotally, if you walked through Baghdad and you didn't know anything, you would think the United States had never been there. You just don't see evidence of the U.S. presence in Baghdad. You do see evidence of Iran's presence in Baghdad. What is the role of the United States in Iraq today from an Iraqi perspective? So those are my two questions for you.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for having me in this panel. First, here in Baghdad, it's very complicated in dealing with any statement comes from the United States, especially from a new ambassador. Everybody here talk about the role of U.S. ambassador here in Baghdad and how it's involving in different things, how it's some talk about a negative role of the ambassador here in intervening in Iraqi politics. So any statement comes from the new ambassador directly talk negatively, and many talk about the negative messages or the new policy that is raises tension inside Iraq. In addition to that, there are who use this kind of statements here in Baghdad in their propaganda and try to show that the United States want to struggle with others, especially with Iran here inside Iraq, and it's not about Iraq, about developing relations with Iraq, and very few people, very few members of the elites here in Baghdad understand the dynamics in the United States, especially among Shia elites. And this is I can connect that with your second question. I believe that the United States didn't do a lot marketing, let's say, or talking about things other than politics, security, military issues, the role of Iran, the role of militias, all those things are the main topics in the American propaganda, let's say, or American statements here in Iraq. The current ambassador tried to do her best to show that there is other side of the U.S.-Iraqi relations, but unfortunately, among all the the tensions, the escalation, the regional escalation, she couldn't do a lot. So with the memory that Iraqis have from the American direct presence in Iraq, the tanks industries, the soldiers, everything remind Iraqis with the security role of the United States, and unfortunately, no other side, no other face, let's say, to the American role in Iraq in the minds of Iraqis, and many groups here in Iraq use this to for some political goals.
Thanks for that, Mohammed. Simona, you came to Baghdad as ISIS was being defeated and really on its last legs, and you saw the transition of ISIS as a group that was holding significantly Iraqi territory to a group that was really on the run. And of course, what we had this kind of tacit partnership, or I wouldn't call it a partnership, but to put it this way, U.S. troops, Iran-aligned militias, the Iraqi military were all working in parallel against ISIS. And then as that threat was removed, we began to see them turn on each other. How would you describe the transition from 2018 to the present in U.S.-Iraq relations, based on your view from the ground?
It's an excellent question, and I can actually offer an anecdote to illustrate how the relationship has evolved. So in 2018, about a year after ISIS was declared territorially defeated, I traveled for the first time to Iraq's border with Syria, to Al-Qaim, which is where these tensions between the PMF and the United States were kind of coming to a head. And at that time, it was kind of, you could see that they had taken over Al-Qaim, they had divided the territory with, the US aligned forces to the north of the river and the Iran aligned ones to the south of the river. And already this tension was beginning to build, but it hadn't really resulted in confrontation. And already at that time, you had the PMF groups who were based there. They would already accuse the US of using their ISR, their surveillance capabilities, to monitor them. And they would even accuse the US, even at that time, when it wasn't the case yet, of targeting the PMF. And I remember putting this question to a lieutenant colonel who was based in Al-Qaim at that time. And what he told me, and I was actually just going back to the interview, in preparation for this discussion, what he told me, we have absolutely never targeted the PMF. It is not in our interest to do this because they are part of the Iraqi security forces. This was in 2018. Fast forward a year, and that dramatically changed. And since then, the relationship really has gone south with frequent tit-for-tat attacks between the two sides. But it just goes to show how you went from 2018, where you still had kind of this post-ISIS coexistence to the years that followed, where you had open confrontations. And fast forward to February of this year, when I went back to Al-Qaim in the wake of the US strikes on the PMF factions that were based there, you had the United States openly targeting the PMF. And this is not, as the Department of Defense was claiming, that these were Iran-aligned militias that were not part of the PMF. No, the truth was that they were actually targeting Brigade 13th of the Popular Mobilization Forces, which are part of the security apparatus. So you really saw over these years a significant deterioration of the relationship, but also it became evident how this US presence under this umbrella of the coalition that is meant to fight ISIS, and it's a refrain that you always hear coalition officials reiterate ad nauseum, really, like, we are here at the invitation of the Iraqi government to fight ISIS. But in reality, what was happening is that this presence was really being used for another purpose, and that's what I think made it increasingly unsustainable.
Thanks for that. Those anecdotes, I think it illustrates the dysfunction we're at quite well. I remember a friend of mine who I served with in the Marine Corps was part of the was involved in an advisory capacity in the retaking of Mosul, and I remember he shared a picture with me where he's right next to a Hash al-Shabi flag. So people, that's unimaginable today in many ways. So that's my anecdote. That's actually not really my anecdote, but was relayed to me. Sajjad, you wrote the English language book on His Eminence Ali Sistani, and of course he issued a fatwa that called on Iraqis to join the Iraqi military, the Iraqi security forces, not necessarily the militias. But what that resulted in was the formation of the militias, some of which became Iran-aligned militias. Now, at the time that Sistani issued that fatwa, ISIS was literally on the doors of Baghdad. There was people forget what the feeling was at that time, but the feeling was ISIS had swept across northern Iraq, and they really could take Baghdad, or at least subject Baghdad to street-to-street fighting if they weren't stopped. And so it was all hands on deck. And of course, one of the reasons for that was because the US had withdrawn from Iraq, and the Obama administration, at least at the beginning, was hesitant to re-enter Iraq. The Iraqis, in some sense, were on their own. But of course, the cost of that is that ISIS was defeated, but now we have the reality of Iran-aligned militias. So you have this kind of history in Iraq, I think, this is my own opinion, of the US solving one short-term security problem or perceived short-term security problem and then creating another for itself. Do you think that's true? And are the Iran-aligned militias something that Washington just has to accept as a fact on the ground? Or are they being delusional when they try to contain them or resist them? Or is it just something that's here to stay?
Thanks, Adam. So, I mean, the groups that the US has a problem with existed before 2014. So clearly the United States had accepted them as facts on the ground. So Kataib Hezbollah was created before 2014. Badr, Asab al-Haq, Kataib Imam Ali, Nujaba, these all existed before June 2014. So firstly, there's a delinkage between that and the fatwa, because the most problematic groups are the ones that were already there before the fatwa. The second thing is the United States had already accepted that these groups were going to be involved. And in the case of, for example, Asab al-Haq, were going to be involved in politics. They started a party, they took part in elections. I think in 2014, they had a member of parliament as well. So the reality is that some of these groups are playing politics, which I guess is acceptable in Iraq's context. So Badr, Asab, they have party members, they run elections, they have MPs, they have cabinet positions, they're involved in sort of formal politics. And I guess that's acceptable to the US as well. The issue is with the groups that do not want to play politics, that want to seek power through other means, groups like Kataib Hezbollah, like Nujaba, like Kataib Imam Ali, Sayyid al-Shuhada, the others. They do not have parties. They don't want to take part in elections. They're not interested in playing formal politics. And I think that's what concerns the Iraqi government first and foremost, and Iraqi policymakers, but also it is a concern to the United States that it finds it very difficult to accept that there are groups outside the control of the Iraqi government that are supported by the Iraqi state infrastructure. They're members of the PMF, their payroll, for example, access to equipment, the legitimacy they have, and yet they are willing to occasionally target the United States as part of what they call the resistance axis. Target the United States because they're occupiers in Iraq, as they put it, or for their support for Israel, for example, or for revenge or engaging in tit for tat attacks. So what will the US do with these very problematic groups? Well, attacking them and taking them completely off the board, I don't think is realistic and possible. So it's tried to, as you said in the past, contain them. It's tried to pressure the Iraqi government to undertake more severe actions to try to limit these groups' capabilities. But the reality is they've developed. They are financially independent of Iran. They are now capable of at least, organizing complex cross-border attacks. They have begun to manufacture their own sort of drones and light weapons. I think Iran has prevented them from having ballistic missiles, but in the future, they may be able to access some of this technology. So it doesn't look like they're getting any weaker. It looks like they're developing and becoming stronger and stronger. So really the question isn't, how to contain them. The US is already trying to contain them, is already accepted that they exist. But it's what next? If the US is there in Iraq, focused purely on Iran, then at some point it's going to clash with these groups. There's no hiding that fact. If the US agrees a deal with Iran, just like Saudi agreed a deal with Iran, these groups become much less problematic. We were in this position a few years ago when we had the JCPOA. Suddenly, at that time, these groups were no longer direct daily threats to the United States because the United States and Iran got on well for a small period of time. Therefore, these groups were no longer targeting the United States. And I think that's the situation where we are today is as the US and Iran remain at loggerheads, the battleground will be Iraq. There's no other way to put it. So for now, I think the US has to be concerned about these groups potentially escalating again. The issue of troop withdrawal is obviously not making much progress at this moment, and I think it is very possible in the next 18 months, 2 years, year or so, that we will see another round of attacks by these groups against US presence in Iraq.
Stephen, so as Sajjad pointed out, many of the more problematic groups existed before the ISIS crisis, before Sistani's fatwa, even though the popular narrative in Washington is often that they took advantage of the ISIS threat, and and now we have essentially this coalition of Iran-aligned militias. How does the US deal with these facts on the ground, so to speak, given that they're a reality that's not going away?
So, yeah, that's a good question, Adam. And I figured you were going to ask it after the previous interventions. I think the United States has to deal, first of all, with two, big problems over which it essentially has no control by definition. The one is that the United States has elections every 4 years. Many Americans probably lament that fact, but as a practical matter, it gets in the way of conducting consistent foreign policy. And, since the United States invaded Iran, there have been several administrations, and they have had different approaches, different policies, different attitudes towards Iraq. Okay, so maintaining continuity under those circumstances is just extremely difficult. It's a structural factor. You can't get around it. The second issue is political shock, intervening variables that appear to come out of nowhere, and that the United States, can't really even shape. And an example would be Gaza, which impelled military attacks by these groups against the United States, ultimately killing 3 U.S. Military personnel, which was going to necessitate a harsh response. There was no way around that. Now that response happened to be actually, inconsistent with the general thrust of the Biden administration's policy towards Iraq. But nevertheless, there was no choice but to conduct that response. And I think administration officials were relatively pleased with it, precisely because it was contained. And the U.S. attacks, as we know, they were harsh and they were widely distributed, and they probably hit more groups than were involved directly in the attacks against the United States because of Gaza. But nevertheless, the clashes died down. They ended with informal truces. Now, I'm not typically optimistic about things in the region, let alone in Iraq. But I thought that the way that tempest was contained to the teapot was a favorable sign of, let's call it, maturity. on the part of the combatants in the fray. I have no doubt, as the other speakers have have expressed, that there could be more political shocks like this in the future. And I also agree that really Iran here, I kind of hesitate to say this maybe, but it's the independent variable. It's because depending upon what Iran does, the United States will react in one or another ways that would impinge on its relationship with Iraq. It's generally, I don't think the United States that starts these things, but getting back, that just gets us back to the original point about lack of continuity, okay? Because Trump kind of changed things by killing Soleimani. And that has been kind of problematic. And now we see publications like Foreign Affairs coming out under the bylines of Graham Allison and Mike Morrell, who was a former acting director of CIA, saying, well, we really got to worry about, Iraqi terrorism in the United States. Well, why? Well, because the U.S. killed Soleimani and put Iran on the spot of having to retaliate for the loss of a popular and important commander. So, these dynamics, as the previous speaker, called them, can be pretty squirrely and wrap both Iraq and the United States in a kind of a difficult situation without much warning.
Thanks for that. I'm going to ask a question to our two Iraqi panelists, and for the sake of time, I'm going to ask Sajjad and Mohammed that you keep your answers to 2 minutes if you can. It's a bit of a provocative question. Do Iraqis want the U.S. military to stay or leave? We'll start with Sajjad.
The Iraqi public or the Iraqi elites, political elites?
Just go through the gambit.
I mean, I would say the Iraqi political elite probably is concerned about the US withdrawing and then the relationship between the US and Iraq deteriorating. So they're looking for a slow, negotiated reduction in troops while maintaining a good relationship with the US. They don't want the US to sort of punish Iraq by forcing US troops out of the country, and instead they're looking for sort of a long-term security engagement, continuation of provision of services that are essential for the Iraqi armed forces, but also things that Iraq does not have the capability for. Surveillance, for example, monitoring the threat from ISIS, provision of certain military technologies, and the fact is the Iraqi economy depends on the US. So the political elite recognizes that it needs to have a good relationship with the US across the board from all backgrounds. But the public, I think the relationship is obviously more complicated. I would say probably the majority of the public are not happy with the fact that the US is present in Iraq in terms of troop numbers. And I think the war in Gaza highlighted some of the things that people have a problem with, that the US is providing cover for Israel, that the US is willing to undertake airstrikes against Iraqi civilians inside Iraq, while Iraqi citizens inside Iraq in civilian areas while it is hosted by the government. I think that situation is just untenable. And clearly, we have communications from the Prime Minister saying we didn't authorize these attacks by the US, for example. We're not happy with them. They're in violation of sovereignty. And I think that messaging gets to people, that people are aware the fact that the US is undertaking actions in Iraq that the government doesn't approve, that is not welcome. Obviously, they're in response to being attacked. We understand that the US is targeted in bases in Iraq, the embassy in the past. US servicemen were killed in the Jordan-Syria border. But the fact is, it's undertaking actions that are not acceptable to the Iraqi public inside Iraq. And so I think, from the public's perspective, I would say maybe a majority, not an overwhelming majority, but a majority of people are unhappy with the situation, not necessarily on, exact troop number count. We're not saying we need to come down from 5,000 troops to 1,700. It's not anything scientific in that sense, but They're just unhappy with the fact that the US seems to be able to do what it wants inside Iraq, and Iraq is not able to sort of maintain sovereignty. The same public are very critical also of Iranian actions and Turkish actions. So it isn't just one way. It isn't just being critical of the US while being completely welcoming to the interference and the actions of Turkey and Iran.
Do you think it's safe to say, I mean, Steve Simons argued this in some of his writing, that there's a concern that if the US were to completely leave, it would make it easier to economically isolate Iraq?
Yeah. I mean, if the US leaves and it leaves on bad terms, let's say, absolutely, that's what it will do. Sanctions make accessing Iraq's complete, all our sovereign wealth is held by the United States. It's in the Federal Reserve in New York. So all our money is there. All our oil sales go over there. So if we're on bad terms with the US, we can expect a massive economic repercussion from that.
Okay, Mohammed, please feel free to ask to answer my oversimplified question with all the nuance you want. Do Iraqis want the US to stay or leave militarily?
I think it depends on who Iraqis we are talking about. Are we talking about Shia, Sunni, Kurds, about the public, the politicians, the government? Each of those groups, let's say, has its own motivations, its own vision about the American presence. But the common, let's say, since after October 7th, is that the role of the American forces in Iraq is kind of an instability element in Iraq. It provides kind of justification for the armed groups to attack, to do, to use this presence as a justification for their actions. This is on one side. For the government, I believe that there is kind of policy for the government to normalize the international situation of Iraq. It's part of what the government want to do. For example, with UNAMI, all those extraordinary situations, let's say, or frameworks that Iraq was put in because of the invasion in 2003, the war on terrorism. Iraq, the government want to change, including the role of the international coalition and the American presence. For the Kurds, it's different. The Kurds maybe find the American presence is kind of cover for them, or protection for them in their relation with Baghdad. I can say there is no one position, but in general, after October 7th, the level of let's say calls or positions against this presence increased, and that also was and always increased with the level of escalation regionally, but mainly internally in Iraq.
Okay, thank you for that. Simona, we've mostly talked about security today. You're one of the few journalists, foreign journalists, who stayed in Iraq after the major ISIS campaign, and I think it's safe to say you really got to know the country in various different dimensions. And you haven't just focused on security. You haven't just focused on ISIS. You've conducted investigations on corruption, on climate. If you had a chance to advise the Biden administration or any other foreign government that has a diplomatic mission in Iraq, what would you tell them are the top 3 or 4 things that they should be focused on in terms of Iraq's long-term stability and the world's relations with Iraq?
Well, I mean, I would not advise any government as a journalist, but it struck me when I was reading the statement of the designated U.S. ambassador, the incoming one, where she mentioned that the biggest threat to Iraq's stability are these, quote, Iran-aligned militias, and it just always strikes me as so far removed from reality, and so overly focused, if not obsessed, with Iran's influence in Iraq, because that's just not how many Iraqis will see it, right? We have other issues that are much greater threats to Iraq's stability, including climate change, including the drug epidemic that is really consuming a big part of Iraq's youth unemployment, corruption, which is practiced not just by Iran-aligned elements, but the Kurds, the Sunnis, really through the entire political spectrum. And these are really the issues that undermine Iraq's stability. And, if we want to talk about foreign intervention in Iraq, why not mention the fact that Turkey has now well over 100 military outposts inside Iraq's territory. But because Turkey is a member of NATO, this is not really mentioned. And I think, the problem ultimately boils down to that I think any administration doesn't have a very good grasp of how it is perceived, how its policies are perceived in Iraq. I mean, this gap has always struck me, throughout my years. I mean, I remember having this conversation with a US diplomat once when we spoke about Kataib Hezbollah, which is part of this so-called axis of resistance. And I was trying to explain, the motives why these groups maintain their arms and are still attacking US troops. And this diplomat said, like, what resistance? What are they resisting? And I think it really goes to show that, American memory is very short, and that's in part because of the election cycle. But for Iraqis, it's very long. The US left in 2011 as an occupying power. They returned in 2014 as part of a coalition. 3 years in between, that's nothing. The US thought they had turned a page from occupier to ally, but for Iraqis, not really much had changed, and when you have a situation where, despite insisting that US forces are part of this coalition to fight ISIS, then at the same time, they use these capabilities to strike these groups. You can't really blame them that they have still this notion, oh, this is still an occupying power. It's not that far-fetched, really. And that's why when you have statements like this, the biggest threat to Iraq's stability are Iran-aligned groups, it really kind of sounds almost a little bit hypocritical, because that's just not how a lot of actors will perceive it on the ground. So I think it really needs to, and I think part of the reason why there is this perspective is perhaps there is not enough interest, or perhaps it's because of the physical isolation of the US embassy, that maybe there is just not enough intermingling and collection with Iraqi society to better understand what are the actual threats to Iraq's stability. I think the average Iraqi youth on the street, unless they're politically active and they're opposing those groups, yes, then in that case they will be in trouble. But the average Iraqi youth will worry about not having a job, about not being able to sustain their family, about not having enough money to get married. That's what they worry about. And that is where I think the greatest threat to Iraq's stability lies.
Okay, thank you for that. Someone in the chat asked if, Brad in the chat asked, is the US providing humanitarian aid to Iraq? This is a statement from April 2024 from the State Department, and it reads, the United States remains Iraq's most significant partner in economic development and humanitarian assistance. And since 2014, the US has invested nearly $3.5 billion in humanitarian and development assistance to Iraqis. So in short, Brad, yes, the US is providing humanitarian aid to Iraq. We have another question. I'll direct this one to you, Sajjad. Tom O'Connor is saying that a number of militias have signaled that they're running out of patience with the US timeline for withdrawal. Do you think that's true, or is that just rhetoric for their supporters, or meant for Iran itself, or is there a genuine impatience with the timeline from some of the Iran-aligned militias?
Well, the issue is there is no clear timeline. There is a process, which they call the HMC, the Higher Military Commission, which is High Military Committee, which is aimed at negotiating the terms under which the US will begin to withdraw troops and transition to a post-coalition mission. But I think we all understand that this is a political decision. It's something that is decided by the NSC and agreed by the White House on when, if, and how US troops will withdraw. It's not something that is agreed by a bilateral committee. And unfortunately, I don't think any progress on this issue will be made before elections in November, for obvious reasons. And then whether there is a new president in the White House or not, the US government will also want to wait and see who's going to be the Iraqi prime minister post November 2025. What kind of government will be in Iraq? If there is an agreement to be made, then who is the partner that they're going to make with? If it's Sudani, he may only be in office for another year and 3-4 months. And so I'm not sure we'll have significant progress on the issue of troop withdrawal this year or even next. And so potentially we're in a scenario where maybe another 2 years before we see any significant progress on the issue of troop reduction. Can these armed groups, militias, resistance groups, can they wait for 2 years? Can they continue supporting the prime minister, or not supporting, but accepting the prime minister's appeal that negotiations and diplomacy is the best way forward? Aren't they part of a resistance axis? And aren't they supposed to be supporting efforts by other groups in Yemen, in Lebanon? And so what is it these groups are doing in Iraq if they're not targeting the US? That's their raison d'etre at the moment. So I think it's very difficult to see next 18 months to 2 years without some sort of escalation. I think these groups are frustrated at the progress of talks on withdrawing troops. But I think at the moment, they are under pressure from the Iraqi government, from Iran as well. I think that was the reason why there was a ceasefire, because the Iranians pushed very, very hard for these groups to stop undertaking unauthorized actions. The attack on Tower 22 was without Iranian knowledge or approval or support. And so you have this point where these groups feel, they're under pressure from several fronts, from the US, from Iran, from the Iraqi government. But I honestly, I think it's a matter of time before they decide to undertake, actions that are likely to escalate or destabilize. Because waiting for 2 years while governments sit in committees to discuss withdrawal, I don't think it's something that's acceptable to them.
I'm going to stay with you on this for a moment, Sajjad, and then I have follow-ups for Mohammed and Stephen. But I mean, the raison d'etre of these militias is attacking U.S. troops. It is a source of instability. As we've all discussed, there's a potential for flare-ups that are unpredictable, as we saw with October 7th. And then escalation happens. Yes, maybe we were lucky enough that after Tower 22, there was a certain maturity, as Stephen called it, between the belligerents. And so we've seen things settle down, but there's no guarantee that will remain the case. So I guess my question for you, Sajjad, is do you think in the long term, U.S.-Iraqi relations would be more stable if U.S. troops ultimately left, assuming they leave in an organized manner? And what could a future U.S.-Iraq relationship look like without U.S. troops on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, so that's contingent upon the nature of the U.S.-Iraq relationship. If troops withdraw, if the relationship is still positive, then I think the net outcome is going to be positive for Iraq. But if the U.S. withdraws not of its own sort of wishes, under fire potentially, potentially a rash decision by a new president, for example, then I think it's not going to be good for Iraq, and it's better if U.S. troops stay where they are. So it really depends on how negotiated the troop withdrawal is. I think it's better for Iraq to have obviously less foreign troops or no foreign troops in the country. I think that's the ideal situation. But how we get to that is probably the most important thing. How do these countries negotiate the right outcome? If it is just one country dictating to the other, I don't think it's healthy. If the US is just insisting that it's going to remain because CENTCOM or the NSC is convinced that it needs to maintain a physical presence in Iraq, then I think that's not healthy for Iraq. And if Iraq is just pushing the US regardless of with the future and wants to push US troops out, then I think also that's not healthy, because obviously the US is in a stronger position to retaliate through other means. So it depends on how we get to that situation. But yes, we do need to see foreign troops reduced and eventually, pull out completely. At the same time, Iraq also needs to show that it's able to control its borders. It has the ability to put down any efforts by groups like ISIS to launch an insurrection, that it's not going to be a threat to other countries' security, like Iran, like Turkey, like Saudi Arabia. And so these go hand in hand. It's not like they're independent of each other. They need to happen at the same time, convincing the international community, or at least regional countries, that it can maintain its own security, and at the same time negotiating the best outcome for the country without facing any serious repercussions.
Actually, I had a follow-up from Mohammed and Stephen, but I'm going to go back to you for a moment, Simona, because the world is a lot bigger than the United States and Iraq. How do you think the region and also European countries that have an interest in Iraq view the U.S. military presence there? Do they view it as a force of stability? Do they view it as something unpredictable? Do they view it as, or I mean, I'm sure there's different views. So how do you think the region and of course some of the US's close European partners view the continued US military presence in Iraq?
Well, I think if you look at Western governments, they look at it as a necessary for stability, and all of these a lot of these countries that are present in Iraq, they are also part of the coalition, and everybody is aware that the United States military is the backbone of this coalition. So they're very much dependent on them. And I think a lot of governments are also fully aware that if the United States were to fully withdraw, then they would have to seriously reconsider their presence in the country. They would have to reconsider the presence of certain NGOs and international organizations. So a full withdrawal, which I don't think is very likely, partly for that reason, would have a serious knock-on effects for the presence of Western organizations in Iraq. And with that, of course, you would have a huge economic impact, right? So you would have a ripple effect on jobs, on contracts that are being awarded, which benefit a very wide spectrum of players, including some of those Iran-aligned actors. So, from an economic perspective, and I don't think it's in the interest of anybody that the United States leave. And, from a political and security perspective, I think there is consensus among Western governments that the United States should stay to be able to protect and support other diplomatic missions and other international organizations. And then, if you look, at the region, you have obviously a very big variety of actors with different ideologies and alignments. If you look at obviously any entity that is part of this so-called axis of resistance, they would like to see the US leave. So so it's correctly pointed out, it is also quite varied if you look at the different components of Iraqi society and of the political spectrum. So it is quite a complicated picture.
Okay, so we've discussed how, due to domestic political reasons in the US and frankly domestic political reasons in Iraq, it's unlikely that there's going to be a withdrawal in the immediate future. Let's call it 1 year. And I agree with that assessment as well, that it's politically unlikely. Somebody asked in the chat how many US troops are in Iraq. It's approximately 2,500, although it fluctuates slightly with rotations. They're there in an advisory capacity, unlike the troops in northeastern Syria that do involve themselves directly in combat, although it's largely viewed that some of the, unofficially it's viewed by some folks that some of the troops in Iraq are more involved than perhaps we'd like to admit. I'll leave that for people's speculation. But at some point, U.S. troops will leave Iraq. I think it's unlikely that U.S. troops are going to be there in perhaps 10 years. Due to the other political forces that we've talked about and the currents in Iraqi public opinion and even U.S. public opinion. So this is a question for Mohammed and Stephen. We only have 4 minutes left. Please try to be brief, maybe 1 to 2 minutes max. We'll start with Mohammed and then go to Stephen. What would a positive U.S.-Iraq relationship look like without U.S. troops on the ground?
I think it's important to go to the normal way of building relations. There's a problem in both sides. In Iraq, that we don't have a clear definition. What is the United States means for us. An enemy or about this definition. And on the other side, I think in the United States, they understand the Iraq as part of the confrontation with Iran. So this gap affects the future of the relation between the two countries. I believe that having a policy for Iraq is very important. Be courage in supporting and encouraging U.S. companies to come to Iraq. Be patient, with the developments in Iraq, which I think it's very positive developments for the future, and to change the way that the United States talk to Iraqis, especially talking to the new generations. I believe that will help a lot in shaping a new phase, a new level of relation for the future, for the relation between the two countries.
Stephen, the last word is yours.
I think Iran is such an important variable in this equation that it's just hard to contemplate a scenario, at least in the near to medium term, where there are not U.S. forces. But I do want to say, as a general matter, the United States likes to have in bilateral relations across the board ties to all the government institutions, in play in whatever country we're talking about, and that includes the military. And I think even if there's no permanent military presence in Iraq, no military bases, the United States and Iraq will probably still want to see U.S. forces flow in for periodic exercises, training, and so forth. And you'll have elements in the security establishment in Iraq, like the CTS, the Counterterrorism Service, that highly value the U.S. presence, will be arguing from within on the Iraqi side for a continued U.S. presence. But I think, just to conclude, a U.S.-Iraqi relationship minus the military dimension, in the future could work out very nicely. And I certainly, hope it does.
Okay, thanks for that, Stephen. Thanks for everyone who joined us today. It was a good turnout. I do encourage all of you to read Sajjad's book on called God's Man in Iraq, and also to check out Simona's reporting investigations, including the documentaries she's been involved in. If you just Google her name, they'll come up, and she has a webpage as well. Sumeria Foundation is doing great work, and please check out some of our briefs and articles in Responsible Statecraft on the Quincy Institute website. I'd just like to thank all of you, especially those who are doing this later in the evening in Baghdad, for joining us today and offering your insights. I wish we had another hour. It feels like we've just begun to scratch the surface as usual. I always come away from these things feeling like I have more questions than answers, but I guess the important thing is that we keep talking. So thanks again for joining.